I mean, this is for the benefit of the audience, Matthew, not you. I assume you already know. I'm Mark Kelly, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Western Sydney University. And I am recording today an interview with Matthew Dal Santo, who I'm actually going to invite to introduce himself a little bit in a second. But about his, I'm hoping that's showing, his newish book, Theocratia, The Theocratic Principle in Russia, 1917 and Today. Matthew, I mean, this may interest our audience insofar as I guess we're an Australian-based podcast. I mean, you're obviously Australian, but work in America. Would you say just a little bit about yourself, what you do, and so on?
Yeah. So, as you said, I'm Australian. I was born in Sydney, but I now work and live in California, and I've been here for almost 5 years. I teach theology to future Catholic priests at the Diocesan Seminary University of the Archdiocese, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of San Francisco.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for that. Look, I'm so excited to be talking to you, and I have so much to ask and to say about your book. So, I mean, I guess I'll say a little bit about the book to introduce it to people, but you should feel free to correct me, possibly wait until I finish, but depending how urgently I need to be corrected. So, I mean, the book's pretty extraordinary, and I think in terms of genre, I think it's probably fair to say it's quite an unusual book. It's certainly not what one would, I think, conventionally think of as a work of academic theology, although it is clearly a work of academic theology amongst other things. So, I mean, I think in terms of its most superficial aspect, it's a travelogue. I mean, the form of the book, but it's a travelogue determined by being something else. So, it's in part, a biography of Saint Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. But it's also, the phrase that comes to my mind is a participant hagiography, or if I go further, participant critical hagiography. So it's you went to Russia on a number of different trips, but over the course of these trips, you followed the physical trajectory of Nicholas II across his life, and you went to the places that he went in contemporary Russia. Looking for the signs of his cult, that is, of the veneration of him now as a saint, talking to people, participated also in the veneration of him as a saint, but critically. So you're kind of inquiring, and I think there's even an element here of a kind of relitigation of the original commission of inquiry into the sainthood of Nicholas II. So Saint Nicholas II was only deemed a saint relatively recently. Obviously, during the Soviet period, the Russian Church could not deem him to be a saint. But he was deemed a saint, but on a relatively thin basis. He and his family, his immediate family, who were all executed with him, are deemed to be, quote, passion bearers rather than martyrs, which would be the fuller category. And I think there's this lurking kind of question in the background, because a lot of people in Russia clearly do consider him to be a full martyr, and this question of whether he's in fact a martyr. So that's two aspects of the book. There's a travelogue. You're going around Russia, so there's a lot of kind of descriptions of your travels, but then it's an attempt to understand Nicholas II's own life and his sainthood, to inquire into the cult as it exists today. So there's a kind of ethnographical aspect with this. But then there's also the theological aspect, and it's, I think, what we might loosely call a form of political theology. So you're deeply here theoretically engaged principally with the thought of Sergei Bulgakov, who's a major Russian political / theological thinker who has his own very interesting trajectory. And there's a lot of consideration of Bulgakov's thought in here. And I mean, this is where the concept, the eponymous concept of theocracia, which is the Russian word for theocracy, comes in. But it's very deliberate. I think you haven't translated it as theocracy because, of course, in English that's a very freighted term, which means something slightly different to what we think the
That's right.
means. Sorry, I'm saying so much. I really should be put this in your own voice, Matthew. But yes, so maybe that's enough from me. Maybe I should ask, actually, because it didn't really occur to me to ask this very much, and I don't think it's a question answered in the book. What led you to write this book in the way you have?
Well, there are a number of answers to that question, I suppose the immediate answer is returning to Russia after many years away, returning to Russia just after the eruption, really, of the Ukraine crisis back in 2014, out of simple curiosity, wanting to go back to this country that has always occupied a special place among my interests. I did enrolled in a course in Russian history at Sydney University, and I went to Russia for the first time as a 20-year-old, simply because I was really interested in Russian history and Russian architecture and Russian art. And then to go back 15 years later, or maybe a little bit more than 15 years later, and to see how much the country had changed, but also how much my impressions of it as a visitor, as a casual visitor on that first trip back, differed from representations of the country in mainstream Western media at the time back in 2014. But also on that trip, or what struck me in particular by comparison to what I'd seen 15 years before, was just how much more visible the revival of the church was in Russian society, and where Russia still seemed very post-Soviet. The first time I went, the second time I went, it was much more visibly a society that, much more visibly an Orthodox society, and I found that intriguing. And how do you revive a Christian culture after 70 years of state-mandated atheism, etc.? All those questions interested me, and my own interest in Russia had to do with particularly the imperial period, and I was very interested in Eastern Orthodoxy for theological reasons, and I'm a church historian and so forth. And I remember one afternoon I was in Moscow. I went out to the patriarchal compound where I hadn't been before, and I was and in fact I described this in the opening chapters of the book. And I see this icon, and the faces are vaguely familiar, but not in that setting. And then I finally realized that I'm looking at the faces of Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children, and that raised for me all kinds of questions as a church historian about how you take somebody from such a well-known figure from world history and canonize and turn them into a saint, so to speak in sort of secular terms, and what's involved in that process. How does an audience receive that, and what does it mean? I mean, and to the extent that the transformation of a person that way is received with sincerity by a particular group of people, what does it say about the society in which something like that is possible? Because I mean, from an English-speaking point of view, to think of Nicholas II as a saint is a stretch. I mean, given what the standard histories of late imperial Russia retail. So from the beginning, my interest was to do with the rehabilitation and the canonization of Nicholas II as a window onto something about Russia, something particular about Russia, about the nature of the society that Russia was. And as I began to think more and more about that, I was led more and more deeply into Bulgakov's writings and various other philosophical, historical accounts of the meaning of the Russian Revolution in the 20th century, hence the various references in the book to Augusto da Noce, and sort of the ideational cause of history in the 20th century and how Russia might fit into that. But even on an even deeper level, I would say that the interest lies in the book lies from a much earlier point in my own life, in growing up in Australia and sort of discovering at one point in the early 1990s a whole box full of newspaper clippings that my grandmother had saved from Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 and the royal visit to Australia. And I mean, lots and lots of clippings. And being struck by the beauty of this young woman in her coronation robes, but also the sort of the higher level of meaning communicated by all the trappings of royalty. And in hindsight, I think it was for me a bit like Bulgakov's experience on the outer embankment, which I lay so much weight on in the book, a kind of theophany, in a sense, something about the person of the monarch acted as a testimony or a witness to the reality of some sort of cosmic order of meaning, in relation to which I felt obliged afterwards to configure my own life. And so the question is also about how, therefore, the political, theological question that the book tries to explore, what is the meaning of kingship as an act of sacred representation? And has Russia retrieved something of Russian culture retrieved something of the representational character of political order, which I think has been one of the casualties of the history of the 20th century in Western society.
Yes, that's right. It's interesting that that example you give, the more local example of the Queen's visit to Australia, and obviously that's well before either of our times. But I mean, you read about that, the level of public enthusiasm for it. It's very, very striking. I mean, something that, I don't know if you ever come across this, but something that struck me particularly was that the amount of backpedaling that the Australian Communist Party, the CPA at that time, did around this event. I don't know if you've ever touched that, but obviously the CPA at that point was on the verge of being banned in Australia.
Right.
Very narrowly avoided it, but also that they had to make these public statements about how they kind of, obviously they were in some sense obviously in favour of republicanism, but they at that time were so on the back foot that republicanism was such an unspeakable term that even the Communist Party in Australia was having to kind of run cover and say, we want the Queen,
That's right.
But this idea, the idea, but it's very hard to imagine today, the idea of Australians having a mass enthusiasm for the monarchy. Even in the UK, it's kind of hard, but things have really changed. And so it's maybe a recent loss, sorry.
That's right. And I think what's doubly difficult is to imagine an appeal behind the monarchy that is greater than mere the celebrity value of a particular figure, or the kind of practical or pragmatic empirical arguments put out in favor of continuity and stability. It seems to me that in the level of enthusiasm that you see in the 1954 visit, there's something much more profound going on than mere celebrity or practicality.
No, that's right. 'Cause it's very striking the level of reductivism there is around this now. Even monarchists kind of argue for the monarchy, and I mean, the UK, it's always been a prominent argument that they bring in tourism or something like this.
Right.
This is absurd. Of course, this is not what the monarchy is there for. And then the conservative argument is something like, well, it's better that than whatever the alternative is, which may be the case. But of course, historically people venerated the monarch in a certain sense, right? And this is and that had that power, the majesty, literal majesty, which we've. And it's not even that it doesn't have it anymore, but that people feel they have to disavow any such notion.
Right. I mean, I think we've lost the ability to talk symbolically. We've lost the ability to recognize symbols as real things, not merely as ciphers or baubles. We've lost the ability to take that side of ourselves, our symbolic imagination, seriously. And I think that's the impoverishment that the phenomenon also reveals. That, I mean, to some extent, I don't think our ancestors in the 1950s would have been able to talk about the sort of the symbolic meaning of monarchy in a very sophisticated way, but I think that they would have recognized the phenomenon if it had been described to them. And I think that we've lost even the ability to do that.
No, but that's so important, because this inability to defend things intellectually. I mean, Bulgakov's so interesting from this point of view, because he's effectively a secularist who has this,
right.
Damascene conversion to monarchism, but because he's intelligent enough to develop a vocabulary to actually understand this, which is why he's kind of so important for your study. Although he's still, when the revolution happens in Russia, I mean, these incredible passages you quote where he describes himself as feeling as though he's died, and he remains silent in the face of it, because he's unable to, not because he's unable to find the words, but the sheer weight of the fact that everyone around him despises him.
He's almost too ashamed. He has the words, but he's too ashamed to pronounce them, because he knows that how deeply unfashionable it would be for an intelligent person to speak in these terms. I mean, I think they are some of the most moving passages in Bulgakov's writings, where he describes the sense of vertigo that he experiences as the monarchy collapses and all his very intelligent friends celebrate the events, only to find themselves 12 months later in the grip of a horrible Bolshevik dictatorship.
Yes, which he predicts as well. Unlike all his good liberal friends who think that we'll have a liberal constitutional government, Bulgakov sees very clearly that without the symbolic power of the emperor, then things will collapse into something else. And yes, indeed it happens with like a grim inevitability. And also this, the fact that there's no stopping point here. I mean, when you describe Nicholas's abdication, there's in the course of about 24 hours, the country passes through a phase that a lot of people expected to stop at, with constitutional English-style constitutional monarchy. But that just becomes unsustainable immediately, and so that he ends up, a prisoner. There's no. Once the spell is broken, it's over. But
and I think, I mean, what I also try to suggest in that chapter is that Nicholas, to some extent, foresaw that he intuited that a merely British-style version of constitutional monarchy, whereas he puts it, the monarch reigns but does not rule, and this was a formula he simply couldn't understand. And I think that he's speaking for more than merely himself there. I think he's also speaking, in a sense, from the depths of Russian culture, that the notion that there should be a ruler who reigns but doesn't actually rule, while sort of the practical side of government is taken over by other people who can carry it out without any sort of sense of long-term accountability is some of the most insightful comments that Nicholas offers in his lifetime, and a point on which I think he stands very much vindicated by history.
Yeah, and his interlocutors at the time are absolutely struck by this, having expected him to be a dimwit, because they think the Tsar is incapable. They can't believe the depth of his reason on this topic. But yeah, no, look, this is interesting. It's an interesting way into the theological complexities of what's being dealt with here. I mean, it occurs to me to suggest here that there's a very general difference in the relationship between this symbolic and the pragmatic here, because that in the West, somehow, particularly on this British model, somehow there's a way that what's found across the course of the 17th century by the Glorious Revolution in England is an ability, I should say in Britain really, to disaggregate the two, and we'll have the symbolic function separated from the practical function of government. But that seems to, as you're suggesting, and Bulgakov's suggesting, that this is not possible in Russia. But maybe, I mean, I tend to think, or my hypothesis, my spontaneous hypothesis, is this has something to do with the difference between Western and Eastern culture, in the sense of Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. That there's a disaggregation which goes back a lot further. I mean, in your book, you follow Bulgakov's line. There's a chapter about this, following it to tracing the real difference in Western culture to Immanuel Kant, to this side, German idealism, which for sure is. I mean, that's certainly following this line, right? If you have this kind of phenomenal nominal distinction,
The difference that you're getting at is more than merely part of the Kantian inheritance. There is a deeper causality at work in both Western and, let's say, Russian or Eastern Orthodox culture than merely the inheritance of Kant. And I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, what I was really hinting at in that chapter about Nicholas's inability to accept a kind of British formula is something of the importance of the intellectual history of the West from the time really of the late Middle Ages. And what I had in the back of my mind is sort of the radical orthodoxy thesis that really the father of modernity is Occam, and his abolishment of universals, and I think that to some extent, this is a point that somebody like Louis Bouillet makes in another domain, in the domain of Catholic theology. The Protestant Reformation is much more the inheritor of late medieval nominalism than the Catholic Counter-Reformation, which seeks to retrieve Thomas's ontologism and Aristotelian ontology. And I think, to answer your question, the only reason why something like the Glorious Revolution can succeed in a place like England is because we're nominalists by this point in time. And so we can receive symbols without necessarily being oppressed by them. We can receive, and we can retain, and we can even pass on a powerful symbol, even a theophanic one, such as the crown and the monarch, without necessarily feeling that we have to be tethered to a strong ontology by it. And I think the truth of that has only emerged slowly and gradually. But I think it's fully evident today, where you have, unfortunately, from my point of view, a Christian monarch presiding over the expansion of abortion laws and assisted dying and other things that seem to me to be metaphysically incompatible with the sacred order that a Christian monarch ought to represent. But nonetheless, that the incompatibility doesn't dawn on most people, because in their minds, politics and the substantive content of politics is not really connected to the symbol, because the symbol has been evacuated of any substantive content. Which is not to say that it's meaningless or worthless, but to say that it has been somehow tragically eviscerated of some of its power.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very obvious connection here to the Protestant Reformation and to iconoclasm, I take it, because this something that it comes up again and again in the book in a very obvious way is the extent to which that I mean, it's true of everything, right? In the Orthodox tradition, everything in the world is iconic. But Nicholas II is certainly a living icon, and because the iconodual position is articulated in Orthodox theology, but also historically in Roman Catholic theology, is that the icons actually, they're real. They're a real living bridge between us and God, much as the Eucharist is the real body of Christ. Well, obviously, what you have, the movement with the Reformation, and of course it's ambiguous. With Luther, it's a little bit ambiguous, but with the harder, disenchantment you get with Zwingli and Calvin, you have this idea that, the Eucharist is just a symbol, precisely that, and that symbols are therefore they're not symbols in the fullness that they might be understood historically, but in this, they're just symbols. The question that comes to my mind, though, and looking at in Russia, you see this happening in the course of a day, but whether we're not over the course of 500 years seeing the same process in the West, that is that actually this is an untenable position. That actually the idea that the monarch is just symbolic. I mean, it seems that the trajectory is the same in every Western country, that eventually they will give up their monarchies, that the monarch will lose respect. That seems to be what we're experiencing. Republicanism seems to be the logical endpoint.
Yes, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for that prognosis. because if a symbol drifts too far from, if a symbol is completely evacuated of any substantive content, it does not ultimately become meaningless. And I sort of think that there is, unfortunately, for the monarchy in Australia and in Britain and elsewhere, a certain, I think one can sense a certain conservative weariness in times when the Crown seems to espouse every progressive cause that comes along. Even now, I think this is the problem that's new. Nobody well understand the desire not to be cast as reactionary, but the price of being part of the contemporary these days seems to be direct conflict with the deeper content and meaning of the order that the Crown symbolically represents. I think the evolution of Western society has reached such a fundamentally such a fundamentally post-Christian inflection that it's very, very hard for a monarch who's still nominally and privately, perhaps also intentionally, Christian, to hold the symbol and the society together without obvious contradiction setting in.
Yeah, this I think raises a really deep question I want to raise with you about something like the historical necessity of what happened in Russia and this general movement. Because one thing it becomes clear when you follow this kind of neo-Kantian progressivism in Russia, which obviously instantiates itself ultimately in Marxism-Leninism. There's obviously that once you've had the Hegelian moment, Marxism-Leninism, then it presents itself as historical necessity.
Right.
And there's a kind of paradox there, which is like it says, okay, this is historically necessary, but then it insists on itself on that basis, right? It's powered by the idea that it's historically necessary. But there's a more general idea in liberalism already of progress that everyone believes that we have to, and that's really key. That idea is really key to the fall of Russian theocracia. As I think you more or less say this in the book, but it's certainly the impression one gets from your reading of it, that the only reason actually that the monarchy falls in Russia is because it's believed among the intelligentsia, it's not the peasantry who believe this, but the people who have the power to decide in Russia believe that it is inevitable that the monarchy will fall. And because actually it's functioning perfectly well, essentially speaking. Indeed, it functions much better than what replaces it, at least in the short term.
Exactly.
So
yes.
It's not its failure to function that leads to its. So
that failure to function has to some extent to be invented.
How does one understand this theologically, right? Particularly, how does one understand this as a question of theodicy? That's the question that kept looming into my mind. Because one of the things, it seems until the last, that Nicholas himself doesn't seem to fully comprehend what's happening. But he constantly prays fervently, he and his whole family, for their salvation and the salvation of Russia, apparently at a secular level. Like they believe that they want Russia to be rescued. They want him personally to be rescued from this looming fate. There's certain intimations towards the very end in his diary and so on that he seems to accept the possibility that he's going to have this fate. But there was, I think I have some kind of answer to this, but there's a real kind of screaming question in my mind as reading through this, that actually, as a Christian, the obvious thing to expect would be exactly what happened, right? If you follow the example of Christ, you go to Golgotha. Right. The most obvious fate for someone who is the most devout Christian, the more devout you are, the more likely you are to be martyred. And historically. And the difficulty is squaring this precisely with the concept of theocratia. And I
Right.
mean, this antinomy, I mean, really is at the heart of it. It's the whole of the book and of the whole concept and the attempt going back
Yeah.
to Constantine, right, the Great,
Right.
to try to think through from a Christian perspective, later from an Orthodox perspective, what it means to have a Christian emperor. Because, of
Right.
course, the early church, you had the emperor and he was the persecutor of Christians and the Christians were the
Mm-hmm.
martyrs. But once the Christians are in charge, you need to have this theology that says, okay, we're in charge now, but we're doing somehow this is compatible with us also, you know, having to bear the cross. And
Right.
so of course that's what an emperor does. They take this impossible burden essentially, which is
Right.
on the one hand of having to be maximally humble, but on the
Mm-hmm.
other hand of having to make decisions, rule people.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a kind of impossible position.
I think it is a kind of impossible position, and I think it touches on the deeper antinomy that I was trying to explore, that between the proper claims of freedom and the proper claims of order, and I think Bulgakov senses that antinomy very strongly, and I think ultimately he can only resolve it tragically. That what God wills for man is both perfect freedom, but also a perfectly free adherence to cosmic order, because cosmic order is inherently good, and what he wants for man is goodness, his own goodness. Um, God is himself perfectly free, but he is also perfectly ordered. There is no chaos in God. And so it's part of how does the world and man as the microcosm of it, how does man go about imaging the divine nature in this way? Um, we have a legitimate aspiration to freedom. We have a legitimate, we have an unavoidable need for order, because order is indissociable from the good. Um, how do we hold on to both of those things in our own lives is perhaps something that all of us struggle with. I mean, I guess that's the heart of any serious personal asceticism, but it's also a political question. It's also a societal question, and the emperor is the one who, in the first instance, bears the brunt of it. And I think that's why, for Bulgakov, um, the emperor is a kind of a Christ-like figure, because he bears the burden of this cross, both of having to reconcile legitimate human aspiration to freedom and also the necessity of representing a cosmic order that man can't use his freedom well apart from. Um, and I think this antinomy is resolved in the church. Pope Benedict XVI explores this really is in relation to the Eucharist, that it's in the liturgy of the Mass that these two things are properly united, and that's obviously a wonderful blessing, but that doesn't alleviate the burden. Or how do we do it elsewhere? How do we do it outside the liturgy, for example? This is what kind of political regime is capable of making this reconciliation. And that was the task that Nicholas was given, and perhaps it was an impossible task. And so what sort of what intrigued me as I was writing the book was how Nicholas managed to sustain his faith in God, even though his every hope he placed in God often seemed to be disappointed from the question of his own family life and his hope for an heir and a successor, and the amount of prayer that he poured into that hope. Then all throughout the First World War, and I think the quite heroic feat, in a properly theological sense, the podvig in Russian terms of Nicholas as a saint was actually quite heroic in the First World War in terms of leading the country. spiritually as well as politically, not thinking of those two things as discontinuous. And for a time, believing that he really can see visible signs of God's blessing upon him, only for it all to come undone at the very moment when it seemed most successful, halfway through 1916. There is, I mean, I think Bulgakov also was struck by this at the time, that even in the middle of 1916, nobody could really have imagined the revolution. People were seriously preparing for the Russian conquest of Constantinople and expecting a Russian victory in the war, which is why the events that follow the abdication are so difficult for people to comprehend. They contradict so much what was expected of in this moment in Russian history.
Mm. Yeah.
And so I mean the question of theodicy and of the way in which history can tragically contradict our expectations of providence must have struck Nicholas privately. It certainly struck Bulgakov, and I think it is a genuinely interesting question.
Yes, I mean, I put it this way, I mean, just to try and tie this up, but it seems to me that what I described as this impossible position, I mean, it's the thing in my mind constantly. I've already alluded to it in a different way, but is that from a Christian point of view, ultimately the prophecy is absolutely clear that in the end, this world will end. There'll be an apocalypse,
mm-hmm.
and consequently, no earthly order can actually endure perfectly. So this, when it comes to what the theocracy actually enjoins, historically as a church teaching, is for the king to try to organize society as if it were heaven on earth. Mm-hmm. But there also has to be a knowledge theologically that we're in a fallen state and that's not going to happen. That the kingdom only comes afterwards. So that actually this is it's known that just as we try to become sinless but we won't achieve it, that this attempt is ultimately going to be a failure. Now, from the point of view of someone in Nicholas's position, you can't acknowledge that, because if you were to acknowledge that the impossibility, you might just give up. So he has to continually persevere. And I mean, this point you make about him not losing faith is really crucial here, and I think really crucial to his sainthood. That no matter what happens, he's like Job, he doesn't abandon his faith.
No, and what's really remarkable, I think, is the amount of store he puts by things such as his coronation oath and the sacramental dimension of his anointing. He does keep faith with what he's undertaken. He does seem to draw strength from the sacramental act that he was subject to, and one of the things I do try to explore in the book is the question of how could anybody have reasonably expected him to do differently than to acquit the model of kingship, of rulership that was enjoined on him by the hierarchs of the church in the most solemn of settings, the Eucharistic liturgy. Surely, in representing to himself the position that he was called to in society is fundamentally unalterable, was reasonable, in fact, given the way it had been presented to him and impressed upon him. And I raise that fact because, I mean, this is one of the reasons why, I mean, I think that the initial canonization committee didn't really do justice to Nicholas's feat as monarch, precisely because it seemed implicitly at least to minimize or downplay the real theological significance of the monarch in pre-revolutionary Russia, and the church's own part in cultivating a sense of what we might call the sacramental nature of political order, at least in inverted commas, with the monarch as some sense the image of God's rule and order over human affairs. And in that sense too, I mean, the book was also consciously directed, if not expressly, to I guess what to my concern, towards current trends in parts of Eastern Orthodoxy, towards too uncritical embrace of liberal democracy, at least in its current secular mode. And to view all of that stuff, the whole era from Constantine to Nicholas II is kind of a bad dream, or it's merely an act of oikonomia that never, as if the church never attributed any theological significance. That to me seems contradicted by the very words of the prayers that the bishops, for example, spoke at Nicholas's coronation, let alone the sacramental actions they engaged in commissioning him, so to speak, as ruler.
It's hard to see to me. I mean, this is really me talking off the top of my head, but how you can possibly have an Eastern Orthodox theology that disowns that legacy, given that the councils are all convened by emperors. Like, right. Because Orthodoxy's core, I mean, canonically is the seven councils. Right. The reason we have those is because they were under imperial aegis. So I don't see how you can just go, well, that was.
And it just so happens that I've just written an article on that. So
amazing!
Yeah, look out for that in the Greek Orthodox Theological Review.
Oh, wonderful! Okay, I will. I mean, this neatly brings us actually to the last point I really have. Thing we have to discuss, which is what the contemporary relevance of this is. And of course, I mean, naturally, this is how you conclude the book, but it is and I don't mean this as a criticism at all, because I think this is necessarily the case, but it's an ambiguous ending you give the book. Yes. I mean, talking about contemporary Russia specifically, that on the one hand, there's this incredible, I mean this in the strongest sense, incredible, revival of Eastern Orthodoxy that seems to be a confirmation of what Bulgakov said, implausible though it is to us now. Bulgakov's idea, the soul of the Russian nation is the Orthodox Church and so on. I mean, this sounds, from a modern secular empirical point of view, ludicrously hypostatizing, as if they're kind of the nation. And yet, despite having endured the most severe persecution imaginable, the Russian Orthodox Church, having been reduced to almost nothing, has flowered back in Russia in an incredible way. And I mean, of course, now receives state sponsorship, but that by itself is extraordinary and something that you couldn't possibly have predicted. So this reemergence of the church is incredible. And of course, with that, it brings the reemergence of the theocratic principle, that these modernist tendencies in Eastern Orthodoxy you're talking about. I mean, of course, you can find them in Russia, but they're not primarily located in Russia. That Russian Orthodoxy, as it's reemerging, seems to be very much the kind of Russian Orthodoxy that existed before the revolution. Right. It's conservative and so on. And yet,
it makes it very much out of place, really, in the world today, because it's really I think the only place in the Orthodox world where the church doesn't exist under a professedly, well, maybe it is a professedly liberal and democratic regime, but one that, at least one where those professions aren't sort of held accountable by some greater organization of global governments, such as the EU, for example, with respect to Greece and Bulgaria.
I suppose Serbia and Estonia are still outside of that. Well, that's largely by accident, I suppose. But nonetheless, indeed, Ukraine, actually, we could talk, but if we don't want to get into that, I suppose. I mean, it's and obviously this is perceived by many, the situation in Russia, to be rather monstrous in the West. It has this, but it's. But it does seem to precisely have this characteristic of a very ambiguous situation where there is a president in Russia who in the West is generally regarded as authoritarian and so on. I mean, personally, I tend to think that Russia is some form of liberal democracy, although I get a lot of pushback on this. But yes, this authoritarian president who therefore is kind of a pseudo czar, but is not the czar, despite his own personal devout orthodoxy. Is not actually assuming this theocratic principle. You have this incredible quote from Putin towards the end of the book, where he disclaims that it should have been possible to manage the transition to liberal democracy in Russia without having the bloodshed of the revolution. Which actually, it's a mark of where he stands on this. Actually, is not that we need to restore the ancien regime in Russia, but that rather we need to have some form of modern hybridity.
Right.
But this is very elusive. I mean, how do we?
It is, and possibly impossible. And that's where the ambiguity. That's the source of the ambiguity with which the book ends. I mean, I'm not convinced myself that there is a synthesis of these various things that's actually historically possible in the 21st century. How is it possible to conceive of some form of actually existing theocratia in Russia that, on the one hand, allows all the good things of modernity actually to coexist with it? Even if it were theoretically possible to imagine a way in which Russia might have evolved towards that without the revolution, or even some way in which it might sort of artificially be constructed today, the task, the various things that need to be held together seem to be so combustible that it seems extremely difficult to imagine that it could ever be realized.
Yes, I mean, it's incredible, really, that Russia holds together the way it does currently. Indeed, many in the West have inaccurately predicted that Russia would collapse in the face of the exigencies of its war in Ukraine. I mean, one thing you note, for example, it's very palpable in Russia, is the extent to which people who are nostalgic for the Soviet period, the busts of Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square, coexist literally right next to sacred sites, religious processions, and sometimes even in the same people. I mean, we have to imagine that there's, because now that there is, I mean, in the same, we have, as you point out, there's political alliances now between the communists and people on the far right, and this somehow Russia coheres.
Yes. Somehow Russia coheres. I think that on the deeper level, and Bulgakov also foresaw this as early as 1918. You can see it in some of his writings there. On a deeper level, there is, between sort of the Russian version of communism, what Marxism must become in terms of when it establishes itself in Russia, and the more theocratically oriented version of Tsarism, something of a synthesis around the more than merely pragmatic nature of political authority, which is one way of representing the liberal alternative. And I think Russia manages to cohere largely on the grounds of either a theocratic or some kind of sub-theocratic understanding of power, of order, as something objectively, maybe not necessarily God-given, but something as good as God-given. In most people's view, there isn't, I don't think, a widespread demand for the kind of electoral politics that we have here, because politics is not understood as being that kind of thing. Politics exists to cultivate and establish a particular kind of order, an order that establishes a certain minimum good, and rather than a kind of maximal freedom. I think that captures the difference between us in a reasonably accurate shorthand way. And I have to, I mean, I think that there's something to be that the difference of outlook deserves our attention and perhaps also our respect, because of the shortcomings of our own perception of politics. I think are becoming more and more evident with every passing year, and something of the pent-up frustration in Western polities, I think, has to do with the unsatisfying account that we give of politics generally and political order, which again I think Bulgakov foresaw in the final chapters of his Unfading Light. He talks about the democratic Caliban and the way in which no political order can avoid being a kind of sacred representation. It's just that an order of politics that is founded on the non-existence of God ends up being a kind of the theocracy of nihilism. And I mean, I think Western societies labour under the nihilism, unconsciously communicated to them by their sort of anchorless political orders, more than we tend to recognise.
Yes, I mean that raises some philosophical questions about actually we're in the back of my mind in this book about political theology and the relationship between politics and theology, because there's a suggestion there. It's the theological vacuum determines politics, but it seems to go both ways. I mean, you're suggesting there that actually the nihilism of the politics isn't infectious to the rest of society. Yeah. I might draw it to a close there then, Matthew. I mean, It's been tremendously interesting, and I just can't thank you enough for writing this book. I mean, it's so stimulating, and it's recommend it to our listeners and so on. And I mean, Matthew's shorter writing as well. I mean, I was recently a friend of mine who is extremely pro-Ukraine, etc., in terms of the Russian-Ukraine conflict, remarked that actually he learned more about Russia from your writings on Russia than any other source, and despite the fact that your position on that is not his at all. So I think in terms of, I mean, there's a project you have here of trying to understand Russia, which is so elusive, that I think that most Western commentators do fail to do this because of this. They understand it and they're trying to understand it in Western terms, and then it just looks incomprehensible to them.
Right, it looks monstrous, in fact, and I think that there are elements of contemporary Russia that really are monstrous. But I don't think that the sources of modern Russian culture are monstrous. I think they're simply different from what we expect the normal to be, and that we continually fail to understand Russia because we represent it from our expectations of it proceed from our own understanding of what reality is, and I think Russia is elusive precisely because it proceeds from other understandings of reality that are connected with Eastern Orthodoxy, and understanding Russia on those terms doesn't mean that you can't lament the existence of this terrible war between Russia and Ukraine, as I certainly do. It would have been far better for it never to have broken out, and I deeply think that it could have been avoided, but that wasn't the case.
Indeed, I mean it's the latest in a history of grotesque tragedies, which is, I mean, earlier phases of which, such as the First World War and the Russian Revolution, are covered in your book. Okay, well,
well, thank you very much, Mark.
No problem. Absolutely, my pleasure.